Piero Hincapié thought he was just talking. Instead, he became the second player eliminated by a rule that didn't exist at any previous World Cup, and it cost his country the tournament. Here's the strange part. Nobody kicked him, nobody elbowed him. He didn't dive, didn't dissent, didn't even raise his voice that anyone could hear. He put his hand over his mouth for a few seconds while talking to a Mexican opponent, and by the time the referee finished his video review, Hincapié was walking off the pitch and Ecuador's World Cup was effectively over. So how does a hand gesture become a red card offense at the biggest tournament on the planet? And why does this keep happening to the same handful of countries? Stick around, because this story says a lot about where football is headed in 2026. Let's set the scene first. Mexico hosted Ecuador in the round of 32, and by most accounts, Ecuador simply didn't show up. Ecuador had been outplayed for most of the night, and tempers started to fray as the results slipped away. Mexico ended up winning 2-0 and moved on to the round of 16, but the headline from that match wasn't the scoreline, it was what happened in the closing minutes when Mexican forward Santiago Jimenez in Hincapié got into it. In the heat of the moment, Jimenez and Hincapié exchanged words, and Hincapié covered his mouth while responding. Jimenez immediately turned to the officials. Referee Slavko Vincic stopped play, went to the monitor, and came back with a red card. Ecuador finished the match with 10 men, and a few minutes later, their tournament was finished too. Now here's where you need some background, because this isn't some obscure technicality the ref invented on the spot. It's a brand new law, and it exists because of something that happened outside the World Cup entirely. The rule traces back to a Champions League match between Benfica and Real Madrid, when Benfica's Gianluca Prestiani covered his shirt before saying something to Vinicius Jr. Vinicius reacted immediately, accusing Prestiani of a racial insult. The referee triggered the racism protocol, and a messy investigation followed that never fully resolved in public. That incident clearly stuck with FIFA leadership. FIFA president Gianni Infantino pushed for a new rule off the back of it. ESPN and the IBAB, which is the body that actually writes the laws of the game, approved the amendments specifically to address discriminatory and inappropriate conduct on the pitch. The logic makes sense on paper. If a player hides his mouth while talking to an opponent or a referee, that's an automatic sending off. No warning, no yellow card first, straight red. If you feel like you're just hearing about this rule for the first time, you're not alone. So here's your subscribe reminder, because we're tracking every single one of these World Cup 2026 storylines as they unfold, and this rule alone has already produced two of the most talked about moments of the tournament. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss where this goes next. Here's where things get interesting though, because Hincapié wasn't even the first player caught by this. That distinction belongs to Paraguay's Miguel Almiron, and his case is worth walking through because it tells you a lot about how confusing this rule actually is in practice. Almiron was sent off in the 3rd minute of first-half stoppage time during Paraguay's group stage match against Turkey after he and Turkey's Mert Mulder exchanged words after a foul near midfield. Almiron covered his mouth, Mulder appealed to the referee, and just like with Hincapié months later, a video review turned into a red card. Paraguay held on with 10 men and somehow survived the rest of that game, but Almiron was suspended for their next match as a result. Now here's where you need some background, because
And there's a detail here that's impossible to ignore. Both Almiron and Hincapié are South American. In fact, if you count Prestiani, all 3 players connected to this rule so far have come from CONMEBOL national teams, Argentina, Paraguay, and Ecuador. Some observers have pointed out that covering the mouth while talking is simply a long-standing habit in South American football culture, which raises an awkward question. Is this rule catching genuine misconduct, or is it disproportionately punishing a gesture that means something completely different depending on where you learned the game? That question got even more complicated a few weeks ago when England's Jude Bellingham covered his mouth during a conversation with Ghana's Jordan Ayew. No card was shown because the exchange was read as friendly rather than hostile, but it created real confusion about where exactly the line sits. If the rule only applies when there's genuine animosity, Referees are now being asked to judge intent in real time, based on body language and a few seconds of muffled audio. That's an enormous amount of subjective judgment sitting on top of what's supposed to be a clear, automatic law. If you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, this is exactly what this channel is built around. So go ahead and subscribe while you're here. We'll keep covering every twist in this World Cup, including whatever the next mouth-covering controversy turns out to be, because at this rate, it probably won't be the last one. Let's zoom out for a second, because context from past tournaments makes this rule look even more unusual. Historically, FIFA has dealt with discriminatory abuse through the racism protocol, which lets a referee stop, suspend, or even abandon a match if racist behavior is reported, and it typically involves a formal investigation afterward rather than an instant sending off. That process is slow and imperfect, but it at least allows for evidence to be gathered before a punishment is handed down. This new rule flips that completely. There's no investigation, no waiting period, no formal hearing before the consequence lands. The gesture itself is the offense, regardless of what was actually said. That's a genuinely new approach in the history of the laws of the game, and it's part of why this story has generated so much discussion. FIFA clearly wanted a rule that couldn't be talked around or lip-read past, and in fairness, that's a reasonable goal. Hidden insults and unprovable accusations have been a real problem in football for years. But instant elimination for a hand near the mouth is also a blunt instrument, and blunt instruments tend to catch people who didn't mean any harm at all. There's also a competitive fairness angle worth considering. Reports have noted that 2026 has already produced more red cards than the previous 2 World Cups combined. And while not all of that is down to this one rule, it's clearly a contributing factor. When a single gesture can turn a winnable knockout match into a man-down survival exercise, that's not a small officiating footnote. That's a rule actively shaping which teams advance and which teams go home.
Now, let's talk about what this actually meant for the people involved, because rules like this don't exist in a vacuum. For Ecuador, this wasn't just an inconvenience. The team was eliminated from the World Cup in a match where the football itself had already gone against them, and a red card in the final minutes only added to how the exit is remembered. Fans in Ecuador aren't just talking about the 2-0 scoreline. They're talking about a hand over a mouth, and whether their team's tournament ended because of genuine misconduct or a defender simply reacting the way he's reacted his entire career. For Paraguay, the fallout was different, but still significant. Alfaro said afterward that Almiron personally apologized to his teammates, understanding the position his sending off had put the team in. That's a heavy thing for a player to carry mid-tournament, knowing one gesture cost his team a man for half a match and himself a suspension. And for neutral fans watching at home, these moments have become genuinely disorienting. You expect red cards for reckless tackles or violent conduct. You don't expect them for something that looks, on first glance, like a player simply shielding his words from a lip-reading camera. That's also affecting atmosphere inside these stadiums. Commentators and fans alike have described a strange pause whenever a confrontation breaks out now, because everyone in the ground knows a hand near a mouth could mean a video review is coming. It's added a layer of tension to ordinary on-field arguments that never used to carry this kind of weight. So, where does this go from here? FIFA and IFAB have a decision to make, and it's not an easy one. The rule's intention, protecting players from discriminatory abuse that can't be proven any other way, is genuinely hard to argue against. Nobody wants to go back to a world where hidden insults have no consequence. But 2 red cards in, both involving players from the same footballing region, both defended by teammates and coaches as habit rather than malice, there's a real conversation happening about whether the current version of this law is too rigid. The best case outcome is probably some kind of clarification before the knockout rounds get much further, maybe a clearer standard for distinguishing hostile exchanges from harmless ones, or a graduated punishment instead of an automatic red. The worst-case scenario is that this rule quietly decides another quarterfinal or semifinal, and the conversation about fairness gets a lot louder right when the stakes are at their highest. FIFA hasn't signaled any immediate rule change, and given how recently it was approved, a mid-tournament reversal seems unlikely, but the pressure from coaches and players is clearly building. Before we wrap up, if you've made it this far, you clearly care about how this tournament is actually being decided, on and off the pitch. So do us a favor and subscribe. We're going to keep breaking down every one of these controversies as the knockout rounds continue. So here's where this leaves us. A rule built to stop hidden discrimination has now ended 2 World Cups early for 2 players who insist they were doing nothing more than talking. It's protected exactly 0 confirmed victims so far in public record, but it's already shaped who's still competing for the trophy. Is that a price worth paying to close a loophole that genuinely needed closing? Or has FIFA created a new way for the tournament to be decided by accident rather than by football? Let us know what you think in the comments, and which country you believe gets caught out by this rule next. This story is still developing, and as always, football never stays quiet for long. See you in the next one.